Hi, everyone. This is Jason Bierek of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest. She's a lawyer with an extensive background. She's a partner at Chaitman, LLP, and she's the co-author of J.P. Madoff, The Unholy Alliance Between America's Biggest Bank and America's Biggest Crook. Helen Davis Chaitman, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jason. It's my pleasure.
Now, Helen, I want to ask you about your background and how did you get involved in the Madoff case in the first place?
Well, I was brilliant enough to put all of my liquid assets into Madoff, and I did that in late 2004. And so December 11th, 2008 was not a good day. That was the day that Madoff confessed that he was operating a Ponzi scheme. And it was coincident, of course, with the global economic collapse. And my area of specialty as a lawyer has been for 30 years litigation involving financial institutions. And when the economy was collapsing and all the firms were about to cave in, the last thing banks were doing was spending money on litigation. So not only did I lose all my liquid assets, but I also stopped having any income because all of my litigations came to a halt. So I decided that I should do something productive with my life, and I started helping Madoff victims on a pro bono basis, not with legal issues, but just with life issues. You know, someone would have a 97-year-old mother in a nursing home, and they wouldn't know how to pay for it and how to raise the money. And I operated a kind of 24-hour hotline to help Madoff investors. And then gradually, I began identifying issues on which I thought I could help investors, and I worked with a number of other people on a pro bono basis, lobbying in Congress and getting clarification of the theft loss under the Internal Revenue Code. And that was very helpful to Madoff investors because they were able to apply for tax refunds for the taxes they had paid on fictitious income over the prior 5 years. So that got them at least some money, because a lot of Madoff investors were third-generation investors. They had all their money in Madoff, and they had no source of income to cover their expenses. And then I began representing Madoff victims in the bankruptcy liquidation, because it was very clear that the bankruptcy trustee was taking positions that were not only inconsistent with the Securities Investor Protection Act, pursuant to which he was appointed, but also that were just particularly devastating to innocent people. And in the course of my becoming a spokesperson for the Madoff investors, I received a certain amount of publicity. And so I was known as a spokesperson for the victims. And one day in late 2009, after Bernie Madoff had confessed and been sent to Butner Federal Penitentiary in North Carolina, I was walking down Lexington Avenue and my cell phone rang, and I said hello, and the voice said, "Helen, this is Ruth Madoff." And I said, "Hello, Ruth." I had never met her. I said, "Hello, Ruth, how are you?" And she said, "I'm fine, but Bernie wants to speak to you." And I said, "Well, how do we arrange that?" And she said, "Well, if you give me a landline, he will call you tomorrow." And so Bernie Madoff called me the next day, and that was the first of a great number of phone calls that I've had with Madoff over the years. And I've used those phone calls to try to get information that would be helpful to my clients. And interestingly, in the very first phone call that I had with Madoff, he said to me, "You know, JP Morgan Chase knew all along what I was doing." Now, given the fact that I wrote the treatise on lender liability, one would have thought that I would have known that from inception. But actually, I was quite shocked when Madoff said that to me, because I just couldn't believe that JP Morgan Chase would involve itself in a crime. But it turned out that Madoff was 100% right. It turned out that JP Morgan Chase knew for over 20 years that Madoff was violating the law. And instead of closing his account, as one would have hoped they would do, and reporting him to the federal government as they were legally required to do, they just figured out a way that they could profit from his crimes. And the ultimate result of that was that they were prosecuted by the federal government. And in one of the Eric Holder specials, instead of sending criminals to jail where they belong, JP Morgan Chase simply disgorged a small percentage of the profits it made on the Madoff relationship and moved on to another crime.
Yeah, I'm looking on your website, JP Madoff, and it says I think that JP Morgan has gotten over $35 billion in fines since the financial crisis of 2008.
It's actually even worse than that. They've paid out 36 billion with a B dollars just in the last 4 years for conspiracy to violate the Sherman Antitrust Act by fixing LIBOR, which is the London Interbank Offer Rate, to which loan agreements for all kinds of people are pegged. So they would take advantage of the fact that they knew what the LIBOR rate was going to be, and they could outsmart other people. There isn't, when you study it, you realize there isn't a statute they're not willing to violate if they can make money on it. And so long as we have a government that doesn't prosecute banks, this is only going to become more and more of a contagion.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, the excuse that they're giving right now why they won't prosecute banks is they're worried about, creating another financial crisis. But I think that's BS. Are you familiar, though, that a lot of these large Wall Street investment banks are not just LIBOR, but they're also being fined for manipulating a lot of other markets like gold and silver and other commodities and other derivatives markets. And, I think JP Morgan also sold, fraudulent interest rate swaps to, pension funds and things like that.
There's nothing they won't do to make money. It's just like an organized crime family. And, the government has to take responsibility for this, because if you're going to take the position that you can't prosecute, let's assume that at JP Morgan Chase there are 1,000 people who are hardened white-collar criminals. JP Morgan Chase is the largest financial institution in the United States. It has 240,000 employees. It does business with 50% of American households and 80% of Fortune 500 companies. Are we really to believe that if you took the 1,000 crooks at JP Morgan Chase and put them in jail, that the bank would collapse? And if that's really true, then it should be closed down.
Yeah, I think that's just a scare tactic so the prosecutors don't go after them. Because we did this in the 1980s, right? The United States, there was lots of banking fraud in the savings and loan scandals, and lots of CEOs went to jail, and the whole economy didn't collapse after that.
No, I mean, it should make the economy better, because where does this money come from? If they're fixing foreign exchange rates or defrauding borrowers on mortgages or defrauding credit card holders, this money is coming from the average, honest, hardworking American. It's not that they manufacture the money, they steal it. And the public are the victims.
Well, Helen, they can also create the money out of thin air. Are you familiar with fractional reserve lending and how that works, and how the central banks like the Federal Reserve basically create money out of thin air and then it's loaned into existence by the banks?
Well, I believe that the number, I may be wrong, but I believe that the number, just since 2008, the Fed has secretly loaned to the few major banks that remain $34 trillion, that's diminishing the value of the dollar for all the honest people in this country.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. Yeah, we know from the one-time partial audit of the Federal Reserve that Congressman Ron Paul and others in Congress were able to get that $19 trillion was printed off, in a very short amount of time and given to basically interest-free loans to large corporations all over the globe, other central banks all over the globe. So that $34 trillion number, if that's true, I don't know where you heard it. Maybe you could tell me offline some of your sources, but that number wouldn't surprise me anymore. I want to ask you more about the Madoff case. Now, I read Harry Markopolo's book, No One Would Listen, talking about how, he figured out in 10 minutes, basically, that the Madoff fraud was a scam. He delivered the evidence to the SEC. He told a lot of his friends on Wall Street, gave them proof, and they wouldn't listen to him. He delivered it to journalists in the mainstream financial media. Why do you think people wouldn't listen to whistleblowers like him and yourself?
Well, it depends who the people are. None of the mainstream media will acknowledge the existence of my book. Why? Because JP Morgan Chase has a huge amount of money to throw around, and essentially it controls the mainstream media. Thank God for programs like yours and people like you who have the courage to speak the truth. But the politicians are all on the take because again, the Wall Street firms are stealing so much money from the public that they can buy everyone in Washington. I mean, why would President Obama appoint Eric Holder as Attorney General following the 2008 global financial collapse when there was massive criminal activity on Wall Street, which victimized the average American citizen? Why would President Obama not have prosecuted those people? Because they bought get-out-of-jail-free cards through their political contribution.
Yeah, this is just very frustrating hearing you and others recount the stories of, corruption and how it wasn't prosecuted. We should have let these guys fail. The part of trying to have a capitalist society or any type of free markets is if these guys make a dumb bet or dumb investment, either their company should go bankrupt and they should be sued, for fraud or things like that. And it seems like the government is just working extra hard to protect them nowadays.
Yeah, and the irony of it is that Obama has been very aggressive in prosecuting welfare fraud. Well, nobody's in favor of welfare fraud, but if someone defrauds the government out of $200 a week, why would we waste resources on prosecuting that person as opposed to someone who defrauds the public out of $200 million a week?
Yeah, I agree. It's really hypocritical. They do this. A lot of the government regulatory agencies, like I've heard on and off the record from, I live right outside of Washington, D.C., so I know people who are still in regulation now and people who have quit, just gotten fed up. And just hearing so many stories over the years, of the larger corporations getting away with pretty much whatever they want, and then government agencies going after the small guy for a little slap on the wrist stuff and, ruining their lives, whereas the big guys, either they pay a small fine or they don't even get in trouble at all. It's just unbelievably hypocritical and dystopian, if you ask me.
And, you mentioned Harry Markopolo. The SEC investigated Madoff 6 times over 16 years, involving 122 different SEC personnel, for which, of course, the taxpayers paid the salaries. And ultimately, after Madoff confessed, they confirmed that he had been operating a Ponzi scheme by making one 4-minute telephone call. And yet, in 16 years with 6 investigations, nobody made that 4-minute phone call. Why? Are we really going to believe that out of 122 people, nobody had the minimal IQ necessary to check with the depository trust company as to whether Madoff was purchasing securities? Of course they had the ability to do that. But yeah. Madoff was a player. He gave enormous political contributions to people like Senator Schumer, and Senator Schumer's on the committee in Congress which approves the SEC's budget.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with the rest of the Harry Markopolo story since I've read his book, and I've also spoken with him in emails over the years. I haven't been able to get him on our show. But yeah, he went into hiding. He was actually afraid, that he was afraid that the government regulators would come in and, take his computers, destroy evidence, even, throw him in jail or kill him for making them look bad, even though he sat down with the people at the SEC office in Boston and explained in easily 10 or 20 minutes that the Madoff investing strategy, there was no way to earn 10% guaranteed returns in that with the amount of options trades that Madoff was claiming. So it just seemed to me like a no-brainer that this was going on, and yet so many people that could have stopped it either looked the other way or didn't even try.
Right. But that's because there's so much money in crime, in financial crime, that the financial services industry can bribe everyone.
And so you haven't gotten any more than a couple minutes on mainstream financial media. I saw in your Greg Hunter interview, you were allowed, I think, 2 minutes on Fox News or Fox Business. Have you gotten any more interviews longer than that recently?
No, and that was a very funny thing because Maria Bartiromo was very sweet, but when she had me on her show and she hadn't realized what I was doing these days, and she said, well, what have you been doing to help the Madoff victims? I said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm suing J.P. Morgan Chase. And she said, suing J.P. Morgan Chase? My goodness, why are you suing them? In other words, they're our big supporter. And then I could hear some static in her earpiece, and she called an emergency commercial. And if she could have physically ejected me from the 41st story window, I'm sure she would have. But 2 men in dark suits came very quickly and escorted me out. That was my experience with mainstream media. And then, of course, about 2 weeks later, she pandered to Jamie Dimon in a half-an-hour interview where he made a total fool of himself, but I'm sure he was very thrilled with it.
Well, she's also married, I think, to a banking executive at Citigroup. So she's a connected lady. Not only are they paying her salary, she's married into the family business now.
Right. Well, good for her.
I want to ask you about how much money the Madoff victims have been able to get back. Are any of them getting back? I know there was some type of cap. So the ones who had more money invested with Madoffs, like the Wilpons who own the Mets, I don't think they got anything back or very little. Are the little guys who invested with Madoff, are they getting most of their money back?
No, they're not. Most of the people who need it are getting nothing, and that's another outrage because there's a statute called the Securities Investor Protection Act, which was enacted in 1970 at a time when we had real people in Washington who did the right thing, not what they were paid to do. And the statute, as it seems from its title, was intended to protect investors. And it provided for $500,000 in SIPC insurance to each customer of an SEC-regulated broker who went out of business. And it set up something called the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, which was made up of all the Wall Street firms. And they were charged with the responsibility of assessing themselves every year with a contribution to an insurance fund, which would fund the SIPC insurance if there was a liquidation. And for the entire period from 1996 through 2008, SIPC decided, that is, the Wall Street firms decided, that the SIPC insurance premium should be $150 a year. Now, it wasn't $150 a year per customer for $500,000 of insurance per customer. It was $150 a year for the entire firm. So let's say Merrill Lynch has 40 million customers. They paid $150 a year for the privilege of assuring every one of those 40 million customers, don't worry, your account is insured up to $500,000. So this is like a joke. I mean, it's hard to believe that this happened. And the General Accounting Office repeatedly warned SIPC and the government that in the event of a major liquidation, there would be not an insufficient amount of money to pay the SIPC insurance. But nobody cared. Madoff happened. SIPC didn't have enough money to fund the insurance. And so they decided that the statute didn't mean what it said. And you don't have to pay people $500,000 based on their last statement. You pay them based on their net investment. Well, here's what that means. Let's say that my grandfather put $100,000 in Madoff in 1960, and that appreciated to, say, $10 million by the year 2005, which wouldn't have been that extraordinary an appreciation over that period of time. So in 2005, my grandfather dies. He leaves me his Madoff account. It's $10 million. I have to take $5 million out to pay taxes, the estate taxes. I'm left with $5 million in the account. Let's say it doesn't even go up. So I have $5 million at the time that Madoff confesses. Irving Picard, the Madoff trustee, comes in and he says, well, congratulations, Helen. You don't get any SIPC insurance. Why? Because your grandfather put in $100,000 in 1960. That's 48 years ago. And you took out $5 million. So you owe me $4,900,000. That's what the Madoff trustee did.
Wow. And even if you got that $100,000 initial investment back, $100,000 from the 1960s is not worth the same purchasing power as $100,000 today due to inflation. Decades later, even with the government's own inflation numbers, that's a lot less purchasing power $100,000 buys you today.
Well, not only, you don't even get the inflation. That was another issue that we litigated because we said at least give the person who put $100,000 in 1960, at least adjust it for inflation. And the court said no, because the SIPC statute doesn't provide for inflation, but the SIPC statute says you get your last statement balance. The court was perfectly happy to ignore that provision, but then it became adherent to the statutory language when it was going to benefit SIPC and hurt the investors.
Yeah, so I think, people have to, You know, the amount of trust, I think, in the financial system, in society in general nowadays is just diminished so much. I don't think people can trust, you know, putting their money into any one account anymore. They have to, you know, diversify and check the counterparty and things like that. There's been so many, you know, these investment banks that have gone bankrupt, whether it's Lehman Brothers or MF Global. There was client money stolen in MF Global. So there's a lot of these things. The other thing is, you know, with my research has shown, you know, with the FDIC and the SIPC, if there is multiple large bank failures, there's nowhere near enough money to cover everyone in these losses. If the people running those banks do take all the customer money and do, you know, make bad bets, and then the firm goes bust, there's not enough money for that. They basically have to go to Congress, and then Congress would have to go to the central bank, the Federal Reserve, to ask to print up the money.
Right. And look what happened at JP Morgan Chase. You know, Madoff kept on deposit just during the period from 2003 to 2006. He kept on deposit at JP Morgan Chase $3 to $6 billion. Now, here's a guy who's an investment advisor. He takes money from people to invest in the stock market, and he keeps it at JP Morgan Chase as a bribe. So what does JP Morgan Chase do with it? Well, Jamie Dimon came to JP Morgan Chase in the summer of 2004. I'm sure he was told, my God, we've got this customer in New York who leaves on deposit $3 to $6 billion. And the next thing you know, Jamie Dimon is setting up the chief investment office in London and hiring young, aggressive traders who do what? They gamble with the depositors' money. Because if he loses, FDIC covers the loss, and if he wins, he gets to keep it.
Yep, there's just tremendous moral hazard in the system right now. So these guys know if they make a big bet and it goes well, they get a big bonus, and you know they're not going to jail. And a lot of times they're not even going to get fired if their bet goes bad. They're just gonna, you know, the guys, their bosses, are just gonna make an excuse and move the money around from one account to another. And you know that's how it worked with that whale trade that you said. I think they lost, you know, $20–30 billion in write-downs, but JP Morgan has, along with their fines, they make so much money coming in every year that the money just comes back magically.
That's right. Well, you know, JP Morgan Chase has never disclosed what the full losses were. The last public announcement was it was about $6.2 billion. But at that point, they took the remaining portfolio and they incorporated it into another section of the bank, and they never reported for the actual losses. So we really don't know what they were. We know it was above 6.2 billion, but we don't know what it was.
Yeah, and there's rumors also with their naked short position on the COMEX in the silver market on their futures contracts. They inherited this from Bear Stearns too over the years. Not sure you're familiar with this, but that they have tens of billions in losses on that trade from being short the silver market. So every time the silver price goes up a couple dollars, they lose another couple $1 billion. There's actually a lot of class action lawsuits now against a lot of the investment banks for manipulating the silver price. It's a big, I'm not sure if you've been following these cases, but there's a lot of class action lawsuits coming now that Deutsche Bank admitted to manipulating the gold and silver price fix, and they're going to name other investment banks as co-conspirators. Well, you know, it's funny because with respect to the manipulation of the foreign exchange rates, they had emails from, you know, let's say, you know, HSBC, Bank of America, Citigroup, and JP Morgan Chase. They had emails among these representatives from each of the banks. And one would say, well, I'm going to fix the rate for the dollar against the yen at 6 p.m. tonight at X. And then someone else would say, okay, well, we'll do the same thing. And then one person actually write, isn't it fun being a cartel? So the next thing that I read was that Goldman Sachs has developed software where the emails are automatically erased. So in other words, they realize that it's not that they're going to stop these criminal conspiracies, it's just they're going to destroy the evidence. It's just amazing. You know, they're in the discovery process now of doing this in the gold and silver manipulation cases. So we'll see what comes out. But that's just dystopian, Helen, where, you know, they know they're manipulating the market. They know that they're cartel and manipulating prices up and down at will. And, you know they have to destroy the evidence. And we have evidence now that they admitted to destroying the evidence, and that, you know, the regulators and people are not going after these guys for harder sentences. I know. It's really a very, very dangerous situation. One of the most indicative illustrations of the corruption at JP Morgan Chase
is a story that was brought out by the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations led by Karl Rove, which was, in my opinion, I think Karl Rove has made such an amazing contribution to this country. And it's so sad that, to me, that he retired, although I understand why he'd want to get out of Washington. But J.P. Morgan Chase had interviewed a young man who had worked for the electric utility company in California, the largest utility company. And, the utility rates were fixed based upon supply and demand. And he told his interviewers at J.P. Morgan Chase that he had figured out a way, that there was a mistake in their formula, and that he had figured out a way that you could manipulate the formula and you could make a fortune. Of course, you would be doing that by increasing the prices of electricity to all the people in California.
That's how Enron made a lot of money as a fraud too.
Exactly. So if you or I were interviewing this guy, we wouldn't be able to get him out of the office fast enough. But J.P. Morgan Chase couldn't get him into the office fast enough. They set him up with a whole team of people, and within 6 months, they were predicting that they were going to make over $1 billion in a year based on what he was doing, which was organized fraud against the users of electricity in California. And you just can't believe that this would go on, and it does. And
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
The courts are very tolerant of it. For some reason, the judges just don't seem to be concerned when crimes are committed by financial institutions.
Yeah, I just shrug my shoulders and say, "Welcome to dystopia." So
Right.
instead of who is John Galt or something like that, it's just frustrating. I mean, there's so much corruption and untrustworthiness in the financial system. It's so many different corporations. I live right outside of Washington, D.C., so both parties in the government are totally corrupt. I don't trust most of the regulators anymore. There are some hardworking, honest ones, but they're more than outweighed by a lot of the ones that either don't do their job or don't care, and just collect a large paycheck now. Do you check Zero Hedge, Helen, to look for the news of
every day?
Very, very good. So you see then Zero Hedge is one of the full honest ones out there on the internet. Well, I want to thank you very much for your time, and keep up the good fight. There's so much garbage going on right now in the financial system. It's really unbelievable. I'm honestly surprised we haven't, had another 2008 collapse based on, something that we see in the news already, but somehow, the stock market keeps going higher, and, the president and the Federal Reserve and all these guys go on TV and keep saying the economy is good and that, everything's hunky-dory. But, my analysis, my research, my evidence probably aligns somewhat with yours. I see the exact opposite.
I agree with you. I always think of the analogy of the emperor's new clothes. There are an awful lot of people telling the emperor his clothes look wonderful and he's running around naked.
Well, if our listeners want to get your book or follow more of your research work or other cases you're investigating, how do they do so?
Well, my website is jpmadoff.com, and you can buy the book or you can buy it on Amazon. If you have a Kindle version that you would want to use, you can get it without charge, and it will link up to the source material in my book, which is hundreds of thousands of original documents.
Very good. Well, thank you again for your time, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future. Unfortunately, Helen, I think there's going to be a lot more scandals coming. We've heard hints from some of my sources that there's more banking shoes to drop. I think one of the major ones is Deutsche Bank in Germany, that there's a lot of scandals coming soon from that bank, how that bank's probably going to be broken up, and there's a lot of manipulations and failures coming from that one.
Yes, I've heard the same thing. Well, thank you so much, Jason. I think you're doing a wonderful job.